Today's block from the Dear Jane quilt book is block F8, which is also called Church Window. First, I'd like to look at Jane's block and the difference between hers and Brenda's. If you look over here at her block, most of it looks to be the same as this drafting out, except for these outer, I guess those would be trapezoid shapes. On Brenda's block, she's reversed them so that the angle is going to go the other way. That to me is a little frustrating, but I think I can make it work just fine. What I've done is I've made a copy of this with my printer. So I have a copy here, and that way I can use it for that final step. Let's look at how we're going to make this block. The center square here measures 1 inch finish, so I'll cut that to be 1.5 inches. These strips are 3/8 of an inch in their width. Same with these little squares, they are 3/8 of an inch. So that means I need to cut these 7/8 of an inch wide, 7/8 of an inch all around here, and then 1.5 inches long for each of these little rectangles. For these flying geese, this here measures 1 3/4 inch wide. So I am actually going to cut that 2 1/4 inches wide by 1 3/8. I got the 1 3/8 because this measurement, the same with these squares here, are 7/8 of an inch. So we'll add that 1/4 of an inch. So I'll cut the squares, and I'm just going to do a snowball type of block on that. I could figure out a larger triangle and cut it in half, but sometimes doing something like that I just get way off. So I'll do all of that around and piece it all together, so I'll get that center block. And then this is where my photocopy will come into play, because I can paper piece right along the strips on here. So what I'll probably do is just cut that strip off, paper piece it so that I get the right angle, and then sew it together, sew it onto my block. So overall, I think it'll be a relatively simple block, just a lot of piecing and a lot of measurement. Anywhere that the focus fabric is, I'm going to be using this purple. So we'll have the purple, which will show up in the squares in the center of these flying geese, and the little corners here, and then the rhombus shapes around the side. So use this purple, and then of course my background will be in that muslin fabric. I've cut all the pieces for the very center part of the square. So I have a center block here, and then the rectangles and the 4 corners. So these are all ready to sew together. On the back of each of the pieces, I've already drawn the 1/4 inch seam allowance along all of the pieces so that I can sew them together. So I'm going to sew these together, and we'll come back and I'll show you the next step. I've finished sewing the center little square here. I did end up having to trim just a little bit, maybe I think it was maybe 1/32 of just a trim around, just to get it a little bit closer to the size that I needed. So now that the center part is done, we're going to take a look. This is my drawing that I've done little math on. But now we're going to work on making these 4 flying geese. So I have my rectangles. I have 4 of these cut, and these rectangles are 2 1/4 inches wide, and let's see, 1 3/8 high. And then I have these squares, which are going to be on the corners. Now with these squares, these are cut 1 3/8 square. And then on the back, I've drawn a diagonal line. This is my stitching line. So I'm going to lay this diagonal on this side, and I will stitch that line just on the inside of that line there. And then I'll flip it up and stitch this next one down on this side. And I'll stitch that across. And so that will make the flying geese. So I have 4 of these units that I need to make. All right, I'm going to go ahead and one thing as I do these, I'm sure if you've made flying geese before, you know, but once I make that stitch and I press it up, I like to press it up and then trim away the parts that are excess in the back. If I end up trimming this away first, I inevitably have this kind of in a skewed position. I don't know what it is, but it's being able to match that to the outside that's already there. So we're going to go ahead and stitch all 4 of these little flying geese. Here are my 4 flying geese. I'm finding that, my square is probably too big for this part because that's going to be more than 1/4 inch seam. But what I'm going to do is go ahead and sew these on to all 4 sides. Also sew these corner blocks in of the focus fabric. So I'll get this square sewn together in this way. So we'll have this entire center sewn together. And then I'll measure to see how close that comes to this center square here. And if it's close enough, then I can move on to the paper piecing. I finished stitching the center of the block, and it actually measures exactly what it should. That is 4 inches for this block, which will measure in perfectly here. Now, with this center one, we're now going to work on these outer pieces. I've already cut apart 2 of the strips to work with. There are 2 sizes that we're dealing with. So we have our shorter side, which we see here in the top and bottom of this block, and then the longer one, which will be on this side. Paper piecing by hand can be a little fiddly, but I actually enjoy this method. This helps to keep you from having to sew through the paper, which if you're doing this by hand can be pretty difficult. We are going to be working on the back side. This first piece, the center one, is going to be our main fabric. So my fabric is cut bigger than it needs to be, but I will have my fabric on the back. I have a little arrow marked because this is where it's going to connect to the block. And so I need to make sure that I have my 1/4 inch seam allowance right there. And I need to have enough space in the back for being able to cut there. So I'm just going, sometimes you can use glue, just an Elmer's glue stick. Ouch. Like this. Sometimes I use that, but today I'm not going to. So I've pinned my piece down so it won't move. My piece number 1 is there, and I'm going to start with connecting this side. Now first I need to create that angle. So I have just this laminated bookmark, and I put it against the seam and I press that over, And I do have a 1/4" ruler. If you don't have that, you can just use any ruler. But the 1/4" ruler actually has a groove right here that allows it to kind of just snug right against that. There. Now I am set for my seam here. Okay. Now I need to make sure I have the fabric proper for this. So I have a piece of fabric here, and as you can see, I've got that 1/4 inch. I'm making sure that my fabric is long enough just so I have enough to trim around. I know it's a little wasteful, but I would rather have it be a little too much than come up short. I've done that way too many times with paper piecing. So what I'm going to do here, now this is a little bit different probably, but I want to keep this stationary because I know this is going to line up, but I need to have that seam right there to have that line up. So it's already kind of seamed there. The pin heads can kind of get in the way, and that's why the glue can be a little bit easier to use. But we'll line that up and just trim off that end there. Okay. All right, so when I sew them, they'll be lined up perfectly. So here is my piece here. Take that pin out because now I'm just going to flip this down and line up that seam allowance. In order to, now I've got those lines, they're perfectly cut. If I need to make sure that I've got that lined up, I can flip my pattern over and I can see it still lines up right there. Okay, now I am actually going to do the paper piecing, but what I'm going to do, now let me pin this, and I'm just going to explain what I'm doing once I get this pinned, because I don't want that to shift. When you're working with long rectangular pieces, just any little bit of shifting can kind of cause a problem. Actually, no. Okay. I am going to pin it along this way. All right. I've got this pinned. Here is my paper piecing. When I open up this pattern and I pretend that I've stitched my seam there, it's going to end up making that seam. But when I stitch, what I'm going to actually do, with most paper piecing, you would then, if you're on a machine, you can just have it folded over just like that and run right through your line. But I'm not going to be doing that with my machine. When I stitch this by hand, I'm going to keep this folded down and I'm going to stitch right along this paper. So I'm not actually going to stitch through the paper, just along it. So I'll just walk you through this one just so you can see. And I do have to move my pin so it's easier for me to handle. Pin it right through the paper so it doesn't shift on me. And I'm going to make sure that I come down long enough. I don't need to have that long of a stitch line, but I also want to make sure it doesn't come apart on me. It's a little bit of a smaller seam. All right, and then I just stitch with a basic running stitch. Okay, that is one stitch. So then I can open up my pattern piece, and you can see I've got a nice seam there, nice and straight, and on this side also nice and straight, and it follows along. Let me move my pin before I lose it. It also, as I finger press it down, I don't have any weird angles or anything like that, but I've been able to do paper piecing through that piece, and it saves actually this pattern, so I can, because I'm going to use this one more time, and I don't have to worry about trying to stitch through paper. So I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. What I am going to do is shift my pin so that it is in a little bit better of a position so that that pin head doesn't get in the way. So now I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'll go through it one more time so you can see how I'm doing that. I have my ruler or my bookmark here on the line so that I can crease that and bring it back. That is now there, and I will use my 1/4 of an inch. So at that line, what's nice about this 1/4 of an inch with that groove and the bookmark, it just butts right up against there, so there's not an issue. And I will trim off that part. Now I know that I won't need any more than that for the fabric, so I'll just cut that off, okay? And then I can use that on this side. So I'll do the same thing that I did before. Basically, when I lay it down, I just make sure that there's enough of an overlap there, and just kind of line that up. So you see I'll have enough of a seam allowance there. I've got plenty of space underneath. So now I pin this piece down so that I can trim the other side, get that 1/4 of an inch. So I'll trim it. And this fabric, I just kind of move out of the way. I don't have to worry because it is pinned down, so it's not going to become skewed or anything like that. Put my 1/4 ruler there and get that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance in there. Okay, so now they're lined up. They both have their seam allowance trimmed. I've got all these little threads. Okay, turn it over, and I'm going to remove this pin because now I want to get these seam allowances to line up. So I just kind of flip it over. And I'm just going to pin the fabric right now because I need to make sure I didn't shift this too much. So I can do that by just folding that pattern piece over, and you can, when you look at mine, you can see it's starting to shift just a little bit too much there. I'm going to remove the pin, and I'm just slightly shifting it. That's a better lineup right there. Now I can pin this, and it's ready to stitch along that. So I will stitch this one. This is just a little bit longer because I'm just showing you this full paper piecing on this piece so that you know what to do for all 4 of them. You'll notice I don't put knots in. I've said this before in other videos. I don't put knots in. I just do a small back stitch for that first one, and that knots it. It saves me from just making hundreds of knots throughout this quilt. I'll remove that pin out of my way, and I'm just doing a running stitch. All of my stitching that I've done for all of these blocks has just been running stitch. Okay, there's that. Trim the thread, and then we open this up. And we can see we've got a nice piece there, and I finger press it down, and we've got a really nice looking piece. This is the longer side, so I can't stitch it to this block yet. I will make another one of these and then two of the shorter ones, and then we'll stitch it together. What I need to do is draw the stitching line on the inside, because I'm going to be removing this paper piece pattern, and I'm going to make just a little mark. This is on the back side, so it's not going to show up, but I have my seam allowance marked in of where that needs to be stitched in, so I'll be able to line that up with the block. And I'm going to go ahead and cut. See, I have enough fabric here. I'm just going to cut the end here. And there. Now I'm ready to stitch 3 more of these. So I'll be back when I have all 4 of these stitched. I now have the 4 pieces finished, and even though it's a different angle, if we look at the image here, the angles are different. So these are still going in the same direction, and on the back of each of them I drew my seam line so I don't get confused on which way they go, because it's easy to do. So this will be toward this block for this side. Same for this one, and then these will go on the upper and lower sections. Let's see. And so then here is my center block. I'm a little close here. Let me see if I can get up a little. There we go. So then you can see my center block will go right in there. Okay, so the pieces are all here. What I'm going to do now is sew these 2 sides on, trim the ends so that they're even, and then we'll sew the outer sides on, and we'll have a finished block. Before I sew the final 2 sides on, I just wanted to briefly come in to show you just a small issue. I mean, it's not a big one, but when I was sewing these on, I noticed that my seam did not come very close to the point here. Because there is enough room that I've given myself plenty of seam allowance, as you can see when I lay this ruler over it, that gives me enough room to kind of adjust things. And so before I sew these on, I'm actually going to make this a 1/4 of an inch for a seam allowance to trim. So I can use my ruler here, and when I line this up, I've got it pretty straight here. This line, there's a hole here so you don't see it exactly, but this line here lines right up with that point. That gives me that 1/4 of an inch. It doesn't seem like a lot that's being trimmed off, but this very little bit will be enough to make sure that I've got a nice even seam right there. And I'll do the same on this side, making sure I have that 1/4 of an inch. And so you'll see that when I trim this, I'm also trimming all the way down, so it gives me a better, just a nice straight seam there. So now I'll be ready to sew these last 2 strips on. I'll come back with a finished block. After pressing and trimming, we now have the finished block F8. also called church window. I hope you enjoyed following along as I did a little bit more in depth on how to make this block. And hopefully the different tips and ideas I gave you will help you in making your own block. If you have any comments or questions, you can leave them below, or you can email me at soitseemscreations@outlook.com. Make sure to like and subscribe so that you'll know each time that I upload a video. And I will see you back here next time. This is Veronica Johnson with Sew It Seems. And remember, keep stitching.